My name is Elena, and I'm somewhere in my late 30s now. Old enough to have lived inside a few different versions of myself. Young enough to remember exactly when I first learned how easily people decide who you are for them. I work in a role that keeps me adjacent to details. Paperwork, timelines, records, the quiet mechanics that make other people's decisions official. It's the kind of work most people only notice when something goes wrong. If you asked the people in my family to describe me back then, they might have used words like practical, helpful, and low maintenance. I was the one who didn't argue, didn't rush the spotlight, didn't make emotional scenes. I listened more than I spoke. I took notes when others told stories. That calmness often got mistaken for passivity, or worse, permission. The story isn't about revenge. It isn't about winning, and it definitely isn't about humiliating anyone. What happened unfolded slowly, through dates on documents, assumptions people never bothered to check, and a silence that looked like compliance until it wasn't. I'm telling this story because it sits at an intersection we don't talk about enough. Family loyalty, inherited power, and the quiet ways trust gets rewritten when money and entitlement enter the room. There's no dramatic villain monologue here, no sudden twists of fate, just ordinary people making choices they believed would never be questioned. At the center of it is something many families think they understand until they're tested by it: ancestral land. A property that carried history, memory, and unspoken hierarchy. After our parents passed, probate began. Slow, procedural, emotionally exhausting. I was present for it, but in the background. I was expected to be. What I didn't know at the time was that while I was being underestimated, decisions were being made without me. Decisions that relied on the belief that I would stay quiet, stay grateful, stay out of the way. One of those decisions involved a deed. Another involved a date that didn't belong where it was placed. This isn't a story about confrontation. It's about alignment. Between facts and timelines, between documents and truth, between how people see you and what you're actually capable of holding together. When the system finally noticed what people hadn't, it didn't do so with drama. It did so with a pause, a freeze, a refusal to proceed. Over the next hour or so, I'll walk you through what it felt like to be overlooked, how silence became intentional, and what happens when you let accuracy speak louder than emotion. I'm not here to tell you who is right or wrong. I'm here to tell you what happened, honestly, and what it taught me about quiet authority. So before we begin, have you ever been so thoroughly underestimated that no one thought to ask what you knew? To them, I was the background constant. Not invisible exactly, just reliably present in a way that never disrupted anything. I was the one who showed up early and left quietly. The one who answered emails without needing follow-ups. The one who could be trusted to handle details no one else wanted to think about. In family settings, that translated into something simpler. I was easy. Easy didn't mean unimportant, at least not on the surface. It meant I didn't cause friction. I didn't challenge decisions mid-conversation. I didn't insist on being heard when louder voices were already filling the room. And over time, people began to confuse my calm with consent. My older brother, in particular, seemed to believe I existed to stabilize situations he didn't want to sit with for too long. He was decisive, charismatic in a blunt way, and used to being deferred to. Growing up, that dynamic was never questioned. He spoke first, he spoke last. I filled in the gaps: logistics, follow-through, emotional cleanup. When our parents died, those roles slid into place without discussion. Probate began, and with it came paperwork, timelines, and lists of assets. The ancestral land was always mentioned with a kind of reverence, as if its importance excused the way decisions around it were handled. It had been in the family longer than any of us had been alive. Everyone had an opinion about it. Very few had patience for the process. I attended the meetings. I listened to the attorney explain the procedure. I read the documents carefully, but no one asked me what I thought should happen. That wasn't hostility. It was assumption. I was there to support, not to steer. At gatherings, relatives would say things like, "You're so good at handling the boring stuff," or "We'd be lost without you keeping track of everything." It sounded like praise, and I accepted it as such. I didn't yet understand how praise can also be a boundary, one that quietly limits where you're allowed to stand. When discussions about the land came up, they happened around me rather than with me. Decisions were framed as already leaning in a certain direction. I noticed that when I asked clarifying questions about dates, about process, about what probate legally allowed, the room would grow slightly impatient. Not angry, just subtly dismissive, like I was slowing things down. So I stopped asking as many questions out loud. Internally, though, I kept tracking. I noted who spoke for whom. I noted when language shifted from we to I. I noticed how urgency appeared only when it benefited one person's timeline. None of it felt dramatic enough to challenge. It felt instructional, like being shown, piece by piece, how I was being categorized. I don't say this with resentment. At the time, I understood why they saw me that way. I had helped build that version of myself, competent, accommodating, emotionally even. I believed that being steady was a kind of integrity, and for a long time it was. What I didn't realize was that steadiness, when you're surrounded by people who equate silence with agreement, becomes a blank check. They assumed I wouldn't push back, that I wouldn't dig too deeply, that if something questionable happened, I'd either miss it or smooth it over quietly. And because I didn't contradict that assumption, it hardened into certainty. Looking back, there were moments when I could have stepped forward, claimed space earlier, reframed how I was seen. But at that stage, nothing felt clearly wrong yet. Just tilted, slightly off balance. Easy to ignore if you trusted everyone involved. And I did trust them. Or at least I trusted the idea of family enough to believe that no one would exploit the gaps in that trust deliberately. So to them, I remained what I had always been. Useful, calm, and peripheral. Someone whose presence made things easier, but whose awareness was never fully accounted for. They never asked themselves what I noticed when I wasn't speaking. The first time something felt wrong, it didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no raised voices, no moment where I could point and say, that's it. That's where it broke. Instead, it arrived the way most boundary violations do, quietly, dressed as convenience. It happened during a routine check-in about the probate timeline. We were seated around a dining table that had been cleared of its usual clutter to make room for folders and coffee mugs. The attorney wasn't present that day. This was just family, catching up on where things stood. My brother spoke with confidence, summarizing progress in broad strokes. He mentioned that he'd handled a few things already just to keep momentum going. That phrase, handled it, caught my attention. I asked what he meant, lightly, not accusatory, just clarifying. He waved it off, said it was nothing major, just preliminary steps, so we wouldn't get stuck waiting later. The others nodded, relieved that someone was taking charge. No one asked for details. I remember looking down at my notes, feeling a faint sense of dissonance. Probate doesn't work like that. There are no harmless shortcuts, no informal pre-approvals that don't touch legal ground. But the room had already moved on, and I didn't want to be the one to drag everyone back into technicalities. So I let it go. A few days later, an email came through, forwarded to me rather than addressed directly. It contained a scanned document related to the land, not finalized, but formatted as if it were. I opened it out of habit, expecting to skim. Instead, I slowed down. The date caught my eye first. It didn't align with anything on the official probate timeline. It was earlier, by just enough to matter. At first, I assumed it was a draft error. Someone reused an old template. Someone forgot to update a field. These things happen. But then I noticed something else. The language wasn't provisional. It wasn't framed as intent or future action. It read as if something had already occurred. I reread it twice, then a third time. Still, I said nothing. That restraint wasn't fear. It was an assessment. I needed to be sure I wasn't overreacting to a clerical oversight. I cross-referenced my notes. I checked the attorney's earlier emails. The discrepancy remained small, but real. When I finally mentioned it, I did so casually. I replied to the thread with a single question about whether the date was a placeholder or final. The response came back quickly, and it was dismissive without being rude. Just internal stuff, my brother wrote. Nothing you need to worry about. That was the cut. Not because of the document itself, but because of what the response implied, that I was being managed, not informed. My role was to absorb reassurance, not to verify facts. I could feel the old instinct rise, to smooth things over, to trust intent over precision. But something about the timing unsettled me. Precision is not optional in probate. Dates are not decoration, they determine authority. Still, I didn't push. I made a note instead, a small mark in the margin of my planner, just a reminder to follow up later, if needed. No one else reacted. No one else seemed to notice. Life continued. Conversations shifted back to logistics and future plans, to what the land could become. The document disappeared into the flow of emails, unremarkable to everyone but me. That's how these things often begin, not with malice, but with assumption. The assumption that no one is watching closely. The assumption that the person who notices won't act on it. At the time, I couldn't have articulated why that moment stayed with me. I only knew that something had changed, not externally, but in how I was listening. The background noise had sharpened. I started paying attention to what wasn't being said. That first small cut didn't hurt. It clarified. After that, nothing escalated all at once. Instead, the pattern settled in. It showed up in the way updates were delivered. Summaries instead of documents, conclusions instead of processes. I would be told what had been decided, rarely how. When I asked for context, the answers were vague, framed as efficiencies rather than exclusions. Everyone was busy. Everyone wanted this resolved quickly. I understood that, or at least I told myself I did. The thing about subtle disrespect is that it's easy to rationalize, especially when you've been trained to value harmony. I reminded myself that my brother was under pressure, that grief makes people controlling, that my role had always been supportive, not directive. Each explanation smoothed over the quiet friction, making it feel unnecessary to address. And yet, the omissions kept repeating. Emails went out without me copied. Meetings happened last minute. Documents arrived already signed, accompanied by reassurances that everything was in order. I was included just enough to remain useful, but not enough to influence trajectory. It was a delicate balance, and it worked because I let it. When I did speak up, I did so carefully. I asked about compliance, about whether the probate court had acknowledged certain steps. The responses were consistent. You worry too much. We've got it handled. Let's not complicate this. Those phrases began to land differently, not as comfort, but as containment. Still, I stayed quiet. Part of that was habit. Part of it was doubt. I questioned whether my sensitivity to process was being mistaken for obstruction. I didn't want to be the person who slowed everything down with technicalities. I didn't want to challenge my brother publicly and create a fracture that couldn't be repaired. So I adapted. I started listening without reacting. I stopped offering unsolicited observations. I focused on what I could control. My records, my notes, my understanding of the timeline as it actually existed, not as it was being presented. Outwardly, I remained the same, calm, agreeable, present. Inwardly, I was recalibrating. The disrespect, by then, had become normalized. No one questioned why I wasn't consulted anymore. It fit the narrative they'd already written for me, and because I didn't protest, it reinforced their confidence that this was acceptable. I noticed how often decisions were justified by urgency. We didn't have time to loop everyone in, but urgency was selective. It appeared only when transparency might have slowed things down. When it came to planning future benefits, there was all the time in the world. There was one moment that crystallized this for me. A relative mentioned, offhandedly, that my brother had already taken care of the land transfer stuff. They said it casually, with admiration. I smiled and nodded, even though I knew that transfer wasn't legally possible yet. That was when I understood. The story being told about the situation had fully diverged from reality, and no one saw a reason to reconcile the two. I didn't correct them. Not then. Correction, I was learning, isn't always the first move. Sometimes it's the last. By staying quiet, I was buying time. Not for them, but for myself. Time to understand the full shape of what was happening. Time to see whether this was carelessness or intention. Time to decide whether my role as the reliable one could be redefined without confrontation. The emotional cost of the silence wasn't dramatic. It was dull. A low-grade erosion of trust that made me more observant, less forgiving of imprecision. I stopped assuming good faith would correct itself. I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting. I was adjusting to the reality in front of me instead of the one I'd hoped for. And in doing so, I realized something uncomfortable. The more I was dismissed, the more freedom I had to see clearly. No one was managing my perspective anymore. They assumed I was still where they'd left me. That assumption would matter later. At the time, though, all it meant was this. Disrespect had become routine, and routine had made it invisible to everyone but me. It took longer than I'd like to admit to name the role they had given me. Not because it was complicated, but because it was comfortable. At least for everyone else. I was the one who made things smoother, the one who filled out forms correctly, the one who remembered deadlines and followed up without being asked. In their minds, that made me dependable. In practice, it made me peripheral. The role wasn't announced. It didn't need to be. It lived in the expectations placed on me and the expectations withheld. I was expected to execute, not to decide, to confirm, not to question, to support outcomes already chosen. Once I saw it clearly, I started noticing how consistently it was reinforced. When my brother talked about future plans for the land, he spoke in singular terms. What he would do, how he envisioned things unfolding. When others asked about my involvement, he'd say something like, "Elena's great with the paperwork," as if that summarized my contribution and defined its limits. No one challenged that framing, not even me. There's a particular kind of invisibility that comes from being useful. People assume you're fulfilled by function alone. They stop asking what you want because they believe they already know. You want to help. You want to keep things running. You don't want the burden of authority. I let that belief stand for a long time. Part of me thought it was strategic, less conflict, less exposure. Part of me thought it was virtuous, to be steady, to not compete for control during a time of loss. But beneath those justifications was something simpler. It was easier to accept a narrow role than to demand a broader one. What changed wasn't an argument or a betrayal. It was a quiet recognition that the role I'd been assigned wasn't neutral. It carried assumptions about my capacity, my ambition, my right to intervene, and those assumptions were being used to justify decisions that affected me directly. The ancestral land was no longer an abstract symbol. It was becoming an asset, something to be moved, leveraged, finalized, and I was being positioned as a spectator to that process, despite being legally entitled to a voice. I remember sitting alone one evening, reviewing my notes and realizing that no one had actually asked for my consent on anything substantive. They'd informed me. They'd reassured me, but consent requires the option to say no, and that option had quietly been removed. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I began to see my role not as a limitation, but as a cover. Because while they were busy assigning me to the margins, they weren't paying attention to what I was doing there. They didn't notice how thoroughly I understood the process, or how closely I was tracking deviations from it. They didn't question why I kept copies of everything. They assumed my reliability meant predictability. In reality, it meant I was prepared hard. I didn't announce any change. I didn't confront anyone about how I was being sidelined. I simply stopped internalizing the role as truth. I treated it as a temporary costume, one that allowed me to move freely without scrutiny. There's a kind of power in being underestimated, but only if you recognize it as such. Until then, it's just erosion. Once you do recognize it, it becomes leverage. Not over people, but over outcomes. By the end of that phase, I understood exactly who they thought I was, and more importantly, I understood what they never thought to check. The role I was assigned had limits. My awareness did not. The shift didn't happen during a conversation. There was no moment where someone said the wrong thing and revealed everything. No confrontation that forced clarity. It happened alone, quietly, on an ordinary afternoon that would have blended into every other one if I hadn't been paying attention. I was reviewing a packet of documents related to the estate, copies I'd kept for my own records, not because anyone asked me to. I'd done it out of habit, the same way I always did. I wasn't looking for errors. I was simply reading. That's when I noticed the inconsistency again. The same date. The one that didn't belong where it was. This time, it wasn't just on an email attachment or a draft-like document. It appeared on something more formal, still unofficial, but closer to the point of no return. I didn't react emotionally. I felt something else instead. Alignment. All the small moments I'd brushed aside suddenly connected. The urgency, the summaries are instead of transparency, the casual way my brother spoke about steps that hadn't legally occurred yet. None of it was dramatic on its own. Together they formed a pattern that couldn't be ignored. For the first time, I stopped asking myself whether I was overthinking. I asked a different question. If this were any other case, what would I conclude? The answer was immediate. There was a procedural problem, potentially a serious one. That realization didn't push me toward action right away. It pulled me inward. I closed the folder. I sat still for a long time. Not because I was afraid of what I'd found, but because I understood that once I acted on it, there would be no going back to how things were. Up until then, silence had been my default. Now, it was becoming a choice. I spent the next few days doing nothing visible. No emails, no questions, no subtle hints. I needed to be certain, not just of the facts, but of myself, of my willingness to follow through without anger or apology. What shifted wasn't my relationship to them. It was my relationship to responsibility. I realized that staying quiet out of politeness was no longer neutral. It would make me complicit in something I didn't agree with. And speaking up impulsively, without preparation, would only hand control back to the same dynamics that had sidelined me. So I chose a third path, patience with intention. I began organizing my notes more rigorously. I laid out the probate timeline as it existed on paper, not as it was being narrated. I marked every point where a legal action was allowed and every point where it wasn't. The discrepancy stood out clearly when seen in that context. It wasn't ambiguous anymore. Still, I didn't feel triumphant. There was no sense of gotcha, just a quiet resolve settling in. The emotional shift was subtle but permanent. I stopped needing their validation. I stopped hoping the situation would self-correct. I accepted that clarity often arrives without permission, and that what you do with it defines you more than how it arrived. That afternoon didn't change my behavior immediately. To anyone watching, I remained the same, calm, agreeable, helpful when asked. But internally, the equation had changed. Silence was no longer something happening to me. It was something I was using. I knew then that whatever came next would have to be handled with precision. No accusations, no emotional appeals, just alignment between process and reality. The day something shifted wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself, but it drew a line I would not cross back over. After that day, my silence changed texture. text us. Before it had been installed, it had been reactive, a way to avoid friction, to keep things calm. Now it was deliberate, measured. I wasn't withholding out of fear or indecision. I was withholding because there was nothing to gain from revealing what I knew too early. I understood something essential then. Information doesn't create power on its own. Timing does. So I stayed exactly where they expected me to be. When updates came, I acknowledged them politely. When my brother spoke in absolutes about plans that weren't legally settled, I listened without correcting him. When others praised him for being on top of everything, I let the comment pass without reaction. This wasn't manipulation, it was a restraint. I knew that if I challenged him directly, he would become defensive. The narrative would shift to intention, how he was just trying to help, how nothing bad was meant. That conversation would center on his feelings, not the facts. And facts were the only thing that mattered. So instead, I watched. I paid attention to the language he used when he thought no one was checking. I noted when confidence tipped into presumption. I noticed how often he referenced outcomes as if they were inevitable, rather than contingent on legal approval. Each of those moments confirmed what I already knew. He believed the process would bend around him, that no one would slow him down, that I, in particular, wouldn't. My silence allowed that belief to grow unchecked. There's an assumption people make about quiet individuals that if they're not objecting, they're not aware. In reality, awareness often deepens in silence. Without the need to defend yourself or explain your position, you can observe with clarity. I used that clarity to prepare, not outwardly, but internally. I reviewed probate statutes in detail, not because I needed to learn them, but because I needed to see how they were enforced in practice. I studied how registrars flagged inconsistencies, what triggered reviews, and what language carried weight in official correspondence. None of this was dramatic, it was methodical. At the same time, I maintained normalcy. I answered messages. I showed up to family gatherings. I didn't withdraw emotionally or physically. That was important. Withdrawal would have been noticed. A quiet presence was invisible. What surprised me most was how little effort it took to remain underestimated. People tend to lock their impressions early and rarely revisit them. Once they'd decided I wasn't a threat to their plans, they stopped monitoring me altogether. Silence in that context wasn't absence. It was camouflage. I wasn't waiting for a moment to strike. I was waiting for the system to do what it always does when presented with conflicting information. Pause. Question. Refuse to proceed until clarity is restored. That's the thing about procedural systems. They don't respond to emotion. They respond to alignment. Dates line up or they don't. Authority exists or it doesn't. There's no room for narrative once paperwork is examined closely. I knew that if I stepped in at the right moment, I wouldn't need to raise my voice. I wouldn't need to accuse anyone of wrongdoing. The facts would speak on their own. And so I stayed quiet. Others mistook that quiet for disengagement. They assumed I'd accepted the version of events being presented. In some ways, that assumption was necessary. It allowed everything to move forward just far enough. Silence had become my choice, not as a form of endurance, but as a form of precision. What they never noticed wasn't a single action. It was an accumulation. While conversations continued on the surface, about future plans, about timing, about how close everything was to being done, I was building a parallel understanding beneath it. Not in secret meetings or dramatic late-night calls, but through quiet, consistent documentation. I kept copies of everything, every version of every document, every email attachment, even the ones forwarded casually with a single line of explanation. I saved metadata. I noted when files were created, when they were modified, when language shifted from tentative to declarative. None of this required confrontation. It required attention. They didn't notice because they didn't think they needed to. From their perspective, the work was happening where power usually lives. Through confident statements, through assumed authority, through momentum. Paperwork was just a formality that would eventually catch up. But paperwork doesn't catch up. It either aligns or it stops everything cold. I mapped the probate timeline against the documents being circulated. Not emotionally, not defensively, just structurally. The gaps were obvious once laid out visually. Certain actions were being referenced as complete before they were legally permitted to occur. The most concerning piece wasn't even the document itself. It was the assumption embedded in it that no one would look closely enough to care. I spent time understanding how registrars actually work. Not in theory, but in practice. I read case summaries. I looked at examples where transfers were delayed or frozen due to discrepancies. Again and again, the same theme appeared. Dates. Dates are anchors. They establish authority. If a deed predates legal standing, it doesn't matter who signed it or why. The system doesn't ask about intent. It asks whether the timeline is valid. That was the leverage, not personal, procedural. They never noticed how comfortable I was with that level of detail. They'd seen me as someone who handled paperwork, but they hadn't considered what that really meant. They didn't understand that my work had trained me to spot patterns others skim past, to see inconsistencies as signals, not annoyances. They also didn't notice how little I spoke about my own conclusions. When you don't announce your thinking, people assume there isn't any. There were moments when I could have warned them. I could have said, "This might be a problem," or "You should double-check that." But warnings are gifts, and gifts are often ignored when they challenge confidence. I wasn't interested in being dismissed again. Instead, I positioned myself to be accurate. I made sure my understanding was airtight. I double-checked statutes. I confirmed filing procedures. I ensured that if I ever needed to raise a concern, it would be framed as a question of compliance, not an accusation. That distinction mattered. I wasn't preparing to confront my brother. I was preparing to engage a system that doesn't care about family dynamics, a system that only cares whether things line up. And the more I prepared, the calmer I felt. Not because I enjoyed having leverage, but because clarity removes anxiety. Once you know where you stand, you don't need to rush. They continued as if nothing was wrong. Plans became more concrete, assumptions hardened, the land was spoken of as already transferred, already secured. All the while, the flaw remained. What they never noticed was that my quietness wasn't emptiness. It was containment. I was holding the entire structure in my mind, seeing exactly where it would fail if pressure were applied at the right point. Not out of spite, out of respect for reality. The private reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no surge of triumph, no sharp intake of breath when everything finally aligned. It came with a stillness so complete that I had to sit back and let it settle before I trusted it. I had laid everything out on my desk. Copies of documents, printouts of emails, my own handwritten timeline. When viewed individually, each piece looked ordinary. Together, they told a single, unambiguous story. The deed, specifically, the date on it, it predated the point at which my brother had any legal authority to execute it. Not by a matter of hours or a clerical gray area, but by a clear margin that couldn't be explained away as a formatting error or an administrative oversight. This wasn't about interpretation anymore. It was about the sequence. And the sequence is not flexible. I didn't label it fraud in my mind. That word carries emotional weight, moral heat. I didn't need it. What mattered was simpler. The document could not stand. No registrar would process it once the discrepancy was noticed. That was the moment of clarity. Not power, clarity. I remember closing my planner and resting my hands on top of it, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Steadiness without suppression. I wasn't holding myself back anymore. I was choosing my next step deliberately. The private nature of that realization mattered. I didn't share it with anyone. Not a friend, not a relative, not even in vague terms. Once knowledge leaves you, it can't be contained. I needed containment. I thought carefully about what I wanted the outcome to be. I didn't want public humiliation. I didn't want family warfare. I didn't want to win at the expense of becoming someone I didn't recognize. I wanted accuracy restored. I wanted the process to return to where it should have been. And I wanted my involvement to be undeniable, but unemotional. That narrowed my options significantly. The registrar's office was the correct channel, not as an accusation, but as a verification. Registrars are not adversarial, they are procedural. They don't respond to narrative, they respond to inconsistencies. I drafted a simple inquiry. No adjectives, no implications. Just a request for confirmation about whether a deed dated X could be valid, given a probate timeline that clearly began at Y. Before sending anything, I reread it several times. Not to soften it, but to strip it further. Every unnecessary word was removed. What remained was factual and neutral. I waited another day before acting. That pause wasn't hesitation. It was respect for the gravity of what I was about to set in motion. Once a registrar reviews a document, there's no quiet undo. Systems leave records. Reviews create trails. But the trail already existed. I wasn't creating a problem. I was illuminating one. When I finally sent the inquiry, I felt no relief, no release. Just a sense of completion, like placing the final piece in a structure that had been assembling itself for months. I didn't tell my brother. I didn't warn him. I didn't give him a chance to reframe or explain. Not because I wanted to trap him, but because this wasn't a conversation issue. It was a compliance issue. And compliance doesn't negotiate. The response didn't come immediately. Registrars don't rush. They review, they compare, they verify. In that waiting period, nothing changed outwardly. My brother continued as if everything was settled. Plans were discussed, assumptions held. I listened, quietly, fully aware that something fundamental had already shifted, even if no one else could feel it yet. The private reveal wasn't dramatic, it was decisive. I knew then that whatever happened next would not be controlled by family dynamics or force of personality. It would be controlled by dates, authority, and the simple question of whether something had occurred before it was allowed to. And I knew the answer. Once the inquiry was sent, the decision was no longer abstract. Up until that moment, everything I'd done could still be framed as observation, as preparation. I could have stopped. I could have chosen to say nothing more and let the situation resolve or unravel on its own. But by engaging the registrar, I had crossed into a space where outcomes would be formalized. That was the point of no return. What surprised me wasn't fear, it was calm. I had already played out the alternatives in my mind. I could confront my brother directly, present the discrepancy, and demand an explanation. That path would have led to denial, defensiveness, and emotional escalation. Even if he corrected the issue afterward, the damage to our relationship would be framed as my fault, for questioning him, for making it a thing. I could also have withdrawn entirely, let the transfer proceed, accept whatever share or explanation I was offered later. That path would have preserved surface peace at the cost of integrity. I would always know that silence had enabled something I didn't agree with. The third option, the one I chose, was impersonal. It removed me from the center of the story. It placed the issue where it belonged, inside a system designed to evaluate facts without bias. Choosing that option wasn't about courage. It was about alignment. I asked myself a single question. If I weren't related to anyone involved, what would I do? The answer was immediate. I would flag the inconsistency and let the appropriate authority handle it. So I did. After that, my role shifted again. Not outwardly, but internally. I stopped monitoring reactions. I stopped anticipating conversations. Whatever came next would come through official channels. That detachment was intentional. Emotional investment clouds perception. I needed to stay clear. Days passed, then more days. No response yet. In the meantime, my brother's certainty increased. He spoke about the land as if ownership were already settled. He discussed timelines for development, for sale, and for use. Others listened, reassured by his confidence. I listened too, not with bitterness, with curiosity. It was strange, hearing plans built on a foundation I knew wasn't sound. But I didn't feel responsible for correcting the narrative in real time. Narratives don't hold legal weight. Documents do. The waiting period forced me to confront something deeper. My relationship to outcome. I realized I wasn't attached to a specific result. I wasn't rooting for a freeze or a reversal. I was committed to accuracy. If the registrar somehow found the deed valid, despite the timeline, I would accept that. Disappointment wouldn't change the facts, but I trusted the process because I had done the work to understand it. That trust steadied me. When the email finally arrived, it was brief, professional, neutral. The registrar acknowledged the inquiry. They requested additional documentation to clarify the discrepancy. The language was careful but unmistakable. The transfer could not proceed as submitted. There it was. Not victory, not vindication, just confirmation that reality still functioned as expected. I read the message once, then again. I didn't forward it. I didn't react outwardly. I closed my laptop and went about my day. The decision point had passed. The consequences were now in motion, independent of my emotions or intentions. From that moment on, there was nothing left to argue about, only responses to what the system would require next. And that was exactly where I wanted things to be. Once the registrar flagged the issue, everything entered a different phase. One that didn't announce itself loudly, but shifted the ground beneath ongoing assumptions. From the outside, nothing seemed to change. There were no urgent calls, no frantic messages, no sudden reversals of tone. My brother continued speaking with the same certainty, making plans as if the transfer were simply a matter of waiting for final stamps. Others followed his lead, reassured by familiarity rather than confirmation. Internally, though, the process had stalled. The registrar's request for clarification created a pause that couldn't be overridden by confidence or momentum. Paperwork doesn't move forward on optimism. It moves when inconsistencies are resolved. I didn't inform anyone of the inquiry or the response. Not because I was hiding it, but because it wasn't mine to announce. Once the system intervenes, communication follows formal channels. My role was finished for the moment. That restraint was important. If I'd shared the update prematurely, it would have shifted focus back onto me, onto motives, intentions, emotions. Instead, I allowed the process to unfold as it was designed to. The less visible I was, the more clearly the issue would be framed as procedural rather than personal. Moving in silence didn't mean disengagement, it meant precision. I stayed attentive to developments. I monitored official correspondence. I prepared for the possibility that I'd be asked to provide supporting documentation. Everything was organized, ready, but not brandished. What I noticed during that period was how fragile certainty becomes when it's unsupported. Small delays were explained away at first. Registries are slow. These things take time. That was true, and it kept suspicion at bay. But as days turned into weeks, explanations grew thinner. Questions began to surface, not directed at me, but floating in conversations. Why hadn't there been confirmation yet? Why was nothing finalized? My brother deflected smoothly, blaming bureaucracy. I said nothing. Silence, at that stage, wasn't passive. It was in alignment with inevitability. The system doesn't respond to deflection. It responds to resolution. Eventually, formal communication went out, not to me alone, but to all relevant parties. The transfer was frozen, pending correction of the date discrepancy. No accusations, no judgments, just a clear statement. The submitted deed could not be processed as filed. That was the moment when silence did its work. I wasn't named as the source of the inquiry. I wasn't positioned as an obstacle. The issue existed independently of me, grounded in documentation. Reactions followed, predictably but unevenly. Confusion first, then frustration, then a scramble to understand how something that seemed so settled could suddenly stop. My brother was the most affected, though he didn't express it openly at first. His confidence shifted into irritation, then into a tight kind of control. He asked questions. He made calls, saws. He searched for explanations that didn't involve error. I remained calm, present, and uninformative. Not evasive, just neutral. If asked directly, I referred back to the registrar's notice. Nothing more. Moving in silence meant resisting the urge to clarify, to explain, to soften the blow. It meant allowing the reality of the situation to stand without my commentary. That restraint protected me. It also protected the truth from being reframed as conflict. By the time the full implications became clear, the narrative had already changed. This was no longer about intention or family disagreement. It was about a procedural failure that required correction before anything else could happen. And corrections take time. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded gradually, like a slow tightening that made itself felt only when movement was attempted. At first, the freeze was treated as a temporary inconvenience, a hiccup, something that could be resolved with the right call or the right explanation. But explanations don't change records. As days passed, the weight of the pause became harder to ignore. Plans that had been spoken about confidently now hovered in uncertainty. Conversations shifted from what would happen next to why nothing had happened yet. The loss wasn't financial at first, it was psychological. My brother's certainty had been a stabilizing force for others. When that certainty cracked, even slightly, it created unease. Not because people suddenly suspected wrongdoing, but because the narrative they'd relied on no longer matched reality. He began to repeat himself more, offering reassurances that sounded rehearsed. He framed the delay as bureaucratic incompetence, as systems being inefficient. That explanation worked for a while. Systems are easy to blame because they don't argue back. But systems also don't bend. The registrar's office continued to request clarification. Each request narrowed the space for reinterpretation. Dates were asked to be confirmed. Authority was questioned. The pause became procedural, not optional. That's when the emotional consequences surfaced. Not anger, at least not yet. More like disorientation, the sense that something solid had shifted without warning. People don't like that feeling. They look for someone to blame, or at least someone to explain it away. My brother grew quieter around me, not confrontational, just watchful, as if trying to locate where the ground had given way. I didn't offer insight. I noticed, though, that he stopped speaking in absolutes. The future tense crept back in. If things go through, once this is sorted, the language adjusted, subtly but unmistakably. Others followed suit. There was a moment during a family conversation when someone asked, almost absent-mindedly, whether probate timelines could affect transfers more than expected. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular. I answered neutrally, explaining that timelines are foundational, that nothing can move ahead of legal authority. No one challenged that. It was too obviously true. That's how consequences deepen. Not through drama, but through quiet acknowledgement of limits. Behind the scenes, my brother was trying to correct the issue. I knew that without being told. The questions he asked became more specific. The urgency is more contained. He was no longer performing certainty. He was searching for solutions. But some problems can't be solved quickly, especially when they involve retroactive justification. Systems are designed to resist that. Dates can't be moved backward to create authority where none existed. The freeze held. What struck me most during that period was how little I felt compelled to react. I wasn't relieved. I wasn't vindicated. I was simply steady. The emotional labor I'd been carrying for months, tracking, anticipating, absorbing, had transferred to the system where it belonged. The consequences were no longer mine to manage. As the reality set in, the tone around the land changed. It was no longer spoken of as an inevitability. It became conditional again, subject to review and correction. The reverence remained, but it was now edged with caution. That shift mattered. It marked the end of the assumption. The consequences had begun, not as punishment, but as recalibration. The process was asserting itself, reminding everyone involved that authority is not claimed, it's granted within bounds. And those bounds had been crossed. There's a point in every slow unraveling when people realize effort is no longer enough. Not because they've stopped trying, but because the window for easy correction has closed. That moment doesn't arrive with an announcement. It shows up as repetition, doing the same things again and again and getting nowhere. That's when panic begins to surface, even if no one names it. My brother entered that phase quietly. He didn't lash out, he didn't accuse anyone openly. Instead, he worked harder. More calls, more emails, more explanations. Each one was carefully framed to make the problem seem smaller than it was. But the registrar's responses remained consistent. Dates cannot be reconciled after the fact. Authority cannot be retroactively applied. The transfer cannot proceed as submitted. Those sentences, delivered in neutral language, carried finality. They weren't hostile. They weren't emotional. And that made them impossible to argue with. I watched the shift happen in real time. The confidence that had once propelled everything forward began to fracture into urgency. Conversations that used to be declarative turned speculative. My brother stopped speaking about the future and started speaking around it, circling possibilities without landing on any. Others felt it too. Family members who had deferred easily before now asked questions. Careful ones, but questions nonetheless. Could this be delayed indefinitely? What did this mean for plans already discussed? Was there a way to reset the process? The answer to that last question was the hardest to accept. No, you can't reset time. You can't undo a document once it's been submitted for review. You can correct errors, yes, but not errors of sequence, not when authority itself is in question. The problem wasn't just the backdated deed. It was the assumption behind it, that speed could substitute for legitimacy. That paperwork was a formality rather than a gatekeeper. By the time that assumption collapsed, it was too late to pretend otherwise. My brother approached me once during this period. Not directly, not confrontationally. He asked what I thought about the situation, framed as concern rather than suspicion. His tone was controlled, but there was tension beneath it. I answered honestly, but narrowly. I said the system was doing what it always does when timelines don't align. That was the only way forward, through formal correction and patience. That there was no shortcut past procedural authority. He nodded, said nothing more. That was the moment I knew he understood, at least partially, that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a miscalculation, and miscalculations have costs. The panic never exploded into chaos. It stayed contained, expressed through frustration and fatigue rather than rage. That made it easier for everyone to save face, but it didn't change the outcome. The freeze remained. What struck me most was how quickly blame lost its usefulness. There was no one to argue with, no decision-maker to persuade. The registrar wasn't an adversary, they were an endpoint. Too late to fix it didn't mean the end of everything. It meant the end of that version of events, the one where momentum replaced consent, where assumption replaced verification. In its place was a slower, more accountable process, one that required everyone to return to the beginning and proceed correctly, this time with all parties acknowledged, including me. The panic faded, eventually, replaced by resignation. Not defeat, acceptance. The kind that comes when reality asserts itself and refuses to be negotiated. And through it all, I remained calm, not because I had planned for this outcome, but because I had prepared myself to accept whatever accuracy demanded. That preparation made all the difference. The confrontation, when it finally happened, barely deserved the word. There was no raised voice, no dramatic reveal, no accusation delivered with emphasis. It took place in a quiet room on an ordinary afternoon when the urgency had already drained out of everything else. My brother asked if we could talk. Not in the tone of someone spoiling for a fight, but in the tone of someone who had reached the end of his explanations. The systems hadn't budged. The registrar hadn't softened. There was nothing left to manage except understanding. We sat across from each other, the space between us neutral. No one else was present, no audience. He spoke first. He said the situation had become more complicated than expected. Those things had moved too quickly, that he hadn't anticipated the level of scrutiny the documents would receive. I listened. When he paused, he looked at me. Not with anger, but with something closer to recalibration, as if reassessing a map he'd drawn from memory rather than measurement. He asked finally, when I had noticed the discrepancy. I answered simply, early. I didn't elaborate. I didn't list moments, emails, or dates. I didn't describe the accumulation of evidence or the hours spent cross-checking timelines. Those details weren't necessary. He asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. That question carried weight, but it wasn't hostile. It was searching. I told him the truth, without ornament. I said that I had raised questions at the beginning and been told not to worry. After that, I chose to make sure I was right before speaking again. That by the time I was certain, the appropriate place to raise the issue wasn't in a family conversation. He absorbed that quietly. There was a long pause, not tense, reflective. He didn't apologize. He didn't defend himself. He didn't ask me to intervene or undo anything. By then, he understood that there was nothing to undo. The process had moved beyond personal negotiation. What he did say was this, that he hadn't thought I would take it that far. I nodded, not in agreement, in acknowledgement. I told him that I hadn't thought of it as far. I had thought of it as accurate. Once the facts were clear, I didn't see another responsible option. There was no heat in that exchange, no need for it. Heat would have implied ego. This was about alignment. We didn't resolve our relationship in that moment. Confrontations without heat don't offer closure. They offer clarity. When the conversation ended, there was no dramatic shift in how we interacted. We were civil, polite, measured. But something fundamental had changed. The assumptions were gone. He no longer spoke to me as if I were peripheral. I no longer listened as if I were. That was enough. The confrontation wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the quiet rebalancing of reality, where authority is grounded in process and presence doesn't require permission. I left that conversation without satisfaction or regret, just a sense that things were now where they should have been all along. I didn't come out of this changed in the way people expect. There was no sharp transformation, no sudden boldness or hunger for control. I didn't become louder. I didn't become harder. What changed was quieter than that, but more permanent. I became exact. Before all of this, I believed that being reasonable would naturally lead to being respected. That if I stayed calm, did my part, and trusted the process informally, things would resolve themselves fairly. I don't believe that anymore. Not because it's false, but because it's incomplete. Reasonableness without boundaries is just availability. Now I'm still calm, still measured, still inclined toward listening before speaking, but I no longer confuse restraint with surrender. I don't wait for permission to verify what affects me. I don't assume good faith will correct structural imbalance on its own. That shift has followed me into every part of my life. At work, I'm clearer about where my responsibility begins and ends. I don't absorb chaos to make others comfortable. I document early. I ask questions once, directly, and I take note of how they're answered. In family settings, I'm present without being pliable. I don't rush to smooth tension that isn't mine to resolve. I don't volunteer myself as the quiet solution to other people's impatience. What surprises people now isn't my assertiveness, it's my stillness. I don't argue. I don't justify. I don't escalate. When something doesn't align, I let that misalignment stand until it's addressed. Some people interpret that as distance. Others interpret it as confidence. I don't correct them. The ancestral land remains in the family, but its meaning has changed. It's no longer a symbol of unspoken hierarchy or inherited entitlement. It's a reminder that stewardship requires accountability and that history doesn't exempt anyone from process. My relationship with my brother is adjusted, not broken, not repaired, just recalibrated. There are limits now that didn't exist before. Not spoken ones, understood ones. I don't hold resentment. That would require me to stay emotionally invested in a version of the past that no longer applies. What I hold instead is clarity. Clarity about how easily quiet people are underestimated. Clarity about how systems respond to facts, not force. Clarity about the difference between peace and avoidance. Who I am now is someone who trusts herself enough to let silence work when needed, and to let structure speak when it matters more than emotion. I don't seek dominance. I don't perform strength. I move carefully, deliberately, and without apology. That's not a lesson I set out to learn, but it's one I won't unlearn. There's a temptation, when telling stories like this, to end with a verdict, to say who was right and who was wrong, to draw clean lines around guilt and innocence. But life, especially inside families, rarely resolves itself that neatly. What it offers instead are lessons, quiet ones, that only make sense once you stop trying to dramatize them. This story isn't about my brother being reckless or malicious. It's about what happens when confidence replaces verification, and when speed is mistaken for authority. It's about how easily systems get treated as obstacles instead of safeguards, until they become the only thing standing between assumption and consequence. It's also about silence. Silence isn't inherently virtuous. It can protect, or it can enable. The difference lies in intention. For a long time, my silence was a habit, something I defaulted to in order to keep things smooth. When it became a choice, it changed shape. It became a way to let truth surface without being forced. What I learned is this: you don't have to be loud to be decisive. You don't have to accuse to correct. And you don't have to seek revenge to restore balance. The most powerful shifts often happen without spectacle. The registrar didn't freeze the transfer because of emotion. They froze it because dates didn't line up, because authority has boundaries, because procedure exists to protect everyone involved, even from themselves. That's the quiet justice in systems done right. If there's a moral here, it's not "don't trust your family" or always assume the worst. It's simpler and harder than that. Pay attention, especially when you're being underestimated, especially when you're told not to worry. Accuracy is not aggression, boundaries are not betrayal, and silence, when chosen consciously, can be a form of integrity. I didn't come out of this story triumphant. I came out aligned with myself, with the process, and with a version of peace that doesn't require me to disappear to maintain it. If you've stayed with me this long, thank you for listening with patience. Stories like this don't offer adrenaline. They offer recognition, and sometimes that's enough. So I'll leave you with one question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated in a way that later turned out to be your quiet advantage?